Yeah, so good evening. Welcome to Concept Club. My name is Benedict Moleta. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and by paying my respects to elders past and present. We're going to hear from three speakers tonight, Wenting He, Tuka Kaikkonen, and Isabel Zhu Maguire. They're all PhD candidates in the Department of International Relations at the Australian National University. In fact, Wenting has recently submitted her thesis, Tuka should have medium to well done stages.
Should have supplemented my thesis.
Yeah, so not raw but not cooked, and Isabel's in second year, as am I. So we're contemporaries, yeah. And they're going to speak to you tonight about just one idea, one concept in international affairs. Wenting's going to talk about ambiguity, Tuka about luck, and Isabel about listening. But they're not going to so much offer a definition of these terms or, claim to unlock their secrets in international affairs, but more share with you something about how these concepts have been involved in their research, whether that's in a particular case or a particular region, or perhaps over time and history, or perhaps in the workings of international affairs, how they work, how maybe they don't work, how some people try to make them work, perhaps. So the Concept Club idea is exploratory rather than a sort of definition idea. And for me, a nice way that was summed up was by Coral Bell, Australian scholar Coral Bell. Some of you may know her work, who wrote in the 60s. She was writing about alliances, political military alliances in the 60s. And one thing she wrote at the end of her book was that she hadn't attempted to give a definition, but to make a contribution to argument. So that's sort of the idea of making a contribution, which then becomes a conversation. So our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for discussion, Q&A at the end. So thank you, and I'll hand over to Wenting.
Thank you, Bandit, for the generous introduction. I'm the Wenting who about to complete the PhD and about to be jobless. As a person who is gonna navigate the very ambiguous job market, so I guess I'm in a very strong position to talk about this concept, ambiguity. But thanks so much for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to present some useful research here. So I think I probably begin by providing some broad context for my book. And why do I focus on this particular concept, ambiguity? I think this is partly because for the past few years, I've been working on my PhD about China's financial reform and China's engagement with the financial order. And as maybe some of you already know, I'm influenced by the constructivism. So I'm sympathetic to the approaches that about the social construction of reality. So when I'm researching the China's financial policy, I'm looking at the different economic ideas about how the China's financial market should be developed and how they can enable the different policy possibilities. And I'm tracing those endless debates about how the China's financial policy should be formulated and discursive interaction about this and in times of stability and economic crisis. So during this research journey, what I found and what really struck me was how much about economics and about finance was not known. So in the face of economic crisis, how confused people, including economic experts and policymakers, were about what on earth is going on in the financial market. And things were not always working out as according to our knowledge. And I think this is particularly surprising in the economic world because we usually tend to assume our economic experts, they're very powerful, right? They manage to do what they want to do. And those ideas, those economic experts' ideas, those coherent, beautiful, and refined economic analysis, we believe in them, right? And we translate them into the practice, and we believe they can defend the market order we are living in. And yes, I think sometimes the economics expertise, they're powerful, but sometimes they ended up with the unintended consequences. And those failures end up with the economic crisis over and over again, and which we have to work through. And those economic crises are the reminders, I think, that what we know is partial and what we don't know is endless. And of course, as humans, we intuitively on gut level, we feel uncomfortable about these limits of knowledge. And we try very hard in trying to generate the knowledge and generate the intellectual debates about economics, about finance, about the related policies, as we try hard to contain and eliminate those limits of knowledge because we feel so insecure about this kind of the cluelessness. So today I wanted to just think it through and make sense of this, okay, about the limits of knowledge. And I will distinguish the three levels of the limits of knowledge, and the ambiguity will be the deepest and the most pervasive concepts about the limits of knowledge, and which is unfortunately largely overlooked by the research nowadays. So I am, of course, not one of the first ones who are interested in the limits of knowledge. And there have been extensive research that contribute to what we know about what we don't know. And the most popular concept in the financial world, I think, is risk. So think about you're checking out your UniSuper account. Have everyone like used the UniSuper account or maybe other superannuation account? So when you open up the UniSuper account, you will see a bunch of investment options, right? The conservative, balanced, and high growth options. And each option will has a risk rating attached to it. So it's very obvious, like the conservative option will be less risky and has a lower risk compared to the high growth option. So what you know about your UniSuper account is first, the investment options you have, and second, and about their potential outcomes, like how likely they are to bring in the returns. But here is the kicker. So no outcome is guaranteed 100%. So even though you choose the conservative option, which seems like that has the highest chance of success, and maybe it could perhaps flop as well. So that's the essence of risk. Even the essence of the risk is that it's sort of the risk is a probability distribution problem. It's a calculable unknown. And in finance world, they've already developed so many strategies to try to reduce and eliminate the risk. They don't like risk at all. So they develop a lot of called risk management strategies. And so the idea is basically like they're looking for the information to try to contain or eliminate the risk. If you have the more better information, this is their ideas. You have the more better information and you know how the financial market works and you know how the other investors think and you know what is the next step those firms will take and you will have the wiser and better and less risky investment option. And that is absolutely preferred, okay? So risk is a very handy concept. But there are some scholars jumping in and they think that there are deeper level of the indeterminacy going beyond the risk, and they called it uncertainty. So in times of uncertainty, it's not just about you can't pin down the probability of those outcomes. You don't even know what the outcomes will be. So think about you are working in a completely dark room, and in risk, you know that there will be like furniture you might bump into, but you just need to guess where they are. But with uncertainty, you have no ideas what's in the room. So you step in the room without any clues what to expect. So according to Frank Knight's book titled Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, Knight distinguished these two concepts and saying that I quote here. In situation of risk, the distribution of the outcome in a group of instances is known. And in the case of uncertainty, it's impossible to form a group of instances because the situation dealt with it in a high degree unique. And in the IPE literature, we have an American scholar called Mark Blyth, and he has a book, Great Transformation. And there, Blyth described the economic crisis is actually such a times of nation uncertainty. And Blyth suggests we can have the institutions to reduce this annoying uncertainty. So he proposed a 5 hypothesis theory and theorized like ideas actually can make the collective action and the coalition building possible. And ideas can provide the institutional blueprint. So if we have the shared ideas, and we can narrow down the outcomes, and with those narrow range of the outcomes, we can stabilize our economic order. Uncertainty is a very useful concept, of course, but there are still, like recently, the scholars jumping in, and they argue that there is still a broader and deeper level of the limits of knowledge and is still overlooked, and that is called ambiguity. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, ambiguity is refined as capability of being understood in 2 or more ways, or we can say it refers to the inherent slipperiness of interpretation. And that is at the heart of the concept of ambiguity. There's a Canadian IP scholar called Jacqueline Best and highlights the concept of ambiguity can be a very useful lens to shed light on the inherent indeterminacy of our social reality. And this is because in our everyday life, we talk to each other and we use the language to talk to each other. And those language, given its complexity, its porousness and opacity, it can shape what, like the scholars like Foucault have argued, is so pervasive in the social reality, and it shapes the inherent contingency of our social reality, including in an economy. And this ambiguity refers to the existence, the permanent existence of the different interpretation possibilities. They can be reduced, but they can't be eliminated. And this is a very powerful concept, I think, especially in the economic world, where we might have the overconfidence about the power of economic expertise. And we are overconfident on that power of the complicated econometric analysis and models, but overlooking the power of language, overlooking the emotions and thoughts about every investors, and the power of the social construction of our economic world. And I feel like we're just about to out of time, so I will quickly wrap up some thoughts about the implications of ambiguity to the politics. So I'm happy to dive in more questions or thoughts during our Q&A session. So there are 3 key messages, I think, about ambiguity and governmentality. First things first, ambiguity can be a challenge for the government, of course, because government need to establish the shared goals and they need to give the concrete shape to the policies, means that in which process they need to reduce the ambiguity to a tolerant level and deliver to the public, right? And second, ambiguity can be also a strategic asset for the government, because sometimes the policymakers, they play around the different interpretations and to suit their preferences. And for this part, I argue in my own thesis that sometimes ambiguity can be useful, ambiguity can be normal. And third, which is also a key interest of my research, is that how ambiguity can be a limit to the government. And when the ambiguity overwhelms the efforts to contain or the exploit it, it would generate unintended consequences, and it sort of open up the space to the failures and to the oddities of the policies. So this is basically my talk, and I'm very curious like how you think about these 3 concepts, and especially curious about whether you have noticed some unintended consequences in the politics that you think really beyond the expectations about their expertise, not only in the economics and maybe in the other fields, that you think this inherent contingency of the social reality might be useful to shed light on that. Thank you.
Next.
Yeah. Hello. Hey, okay. So good evening, and lovely to see you all here. And thanks so much for Benedict for getting us here among friends. So I'm Tuukka, as mentioned. I believe I met most of you, and if I haven't, look forward to speaking with you tonight. So very pleased and honored to be here as one of the three speakers for this iteration of the Concept Club. And I suppose part of the challenge for me tonight is also to sort of bridge these two amazing speakers somehow. That will be my challenge for myself, and I'm just gonna set my timer so as not to ramble over time. So anyway, my concept here, and I think there'll be some fun play between the different concepts as we go along. Mine is luck. So what is this four-letter word doing here in AIIA tonight? Why am I here? And that's a question I often ask myself every morning as I get up and work on my PhD thesis. But this is the concept that is informing my work here tonight, and also that has been informing our work over the past 4 years of my PhD, which I promise I'll bring to a close, if not this year, then next. Anyways, so I was thinking, okay, how to kick off this concept talk. And as I was browsing the bookshelves there in our sort of a space next door, something that caught my eye was this book. So by Paul Tilley, titled Mixed Fortunes, A History of Tax Reform in Australia. All right, so I'm not going to be talking about tax reform in Australia, although that might link to the sort of economic sphere of things, but that's very far from my expertise. But I think it is quite instructive that here we have a book with fortune in the title, right? So as one of the closely related concepts that ties in with luck, but nevertheless has some distinct flavor of its own, although often that flavor is quite ambiguous. But it actually turns out that this is a follow-up to a previous book by the same author called Changing Fortunes, A History of the Australian Treasury. So setting that aside, why then talk about luck? Well, I would like to invite you now to consider three sort of pivotal events in the history of world politics over the past a bit over a century. So first would be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on 28th of June, 1914. The second would be the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. And the third example would be the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. Okay, so what unites these three different scenarios? Well, probably many things, not least that they are all, of course, these sort of important moments in over the past century. But I think one thing that is interesting about this is that often these events have been thought about as sort of almost like a surface level manifestations of some deeper underlying realities of structures. As they were almost determined by what was happening in politics at the time. And maybe even if those particular things hadn't happened the way they did, the outcomes would nevertheless have been similar. So the First World War would have happened. The atomic bombings would, regardless, taken place, and the missile crisis would nevertheless have been resolved, peacefully, regardless of the sort of granular detail of how it all happened. But what I try to contest in my thesis is that actually, when we look closely, we often find that many of these events were hanging on various kinds of contingencies that could not have been predicted, were not predicted, and also if we lose sight of those contingencies, of those chance events, of the luck of politics, we actually lose a lot of the important explanatory content from how we think about world politics. Okay, so what about those three events? So this is all coming from work done by others previously, so not my sort of first-hand research, but I think these are helpful illustrations for how luck, I would argue, matters for international politics. So as we would know, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, but actually he had already been a subject of an assassination attempt on the same day, but that had failed. But then his entourage took a wrong turn in the city of Sarajevo and happened to cross paths with the Serb nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Well, the rest is history. What about then the bombing of, say, Nagasaki? Well, as you would know, Nagasaki was not actually the priority target on that day, but instead what the US were prioritizing was the city of Kokura. However, it so happened that on the morning, the weather was inclement to bombing of that particular city with the atomic bomb, and therefore Nagasaki was chosen instead. And lastly, the peaceful resolution of the missile crisis. Well, over the 13 days, there were moments of escalation and de-escalation. And one point of escalation was during the US quarantine of Cuba in order to prevent Soviet subs of entering Cuba. There was a moment when the US Navy and Air Force were strafing, basically firing warning shots at the Soviet subs. And one of the subs had lost contact with the Soviet headquarters and quite reasonably thought that they were under attack and the war was on. So they were starting to go below the surface. However, it is said that there was a rather stocky fellow who was stuck in the conning tower of that particular submarine, and that then delayed the submersion of that submarine. And the significance of that was that that then gave time for the Soviets to actually figure out that they were not in war yet. And this was important because had they gone down, they would have been preparing to launch their nuclear torpedoes. So I think these three examples show us that, okay, when we look at the more granular level, we can see that a lot seems to actually hang on various kinds of chance contingent events, right? And I would then argue that we can talk of these things under the umbrella label of luck. And I would then argue that luck actually does matter a lot to how we think about international politics. Because again, it matters to how, first of all, how we describe events, right? How we analyze why and how did things happen the way they did. And perhaps often, if we look closely enough, we might find that things were far less determined, far less rational than we might have thought. This then, I would also argue, matters for what sorts of lessons we draw from those historical events. Again, was it that reason triumphed, or was it a happy coming together of various different kinds of things, or not so happy, at least for, say, the citizens of Nagasaki? And then I think these examples and how we think about luck in international politics also then matters also for who we blame or who we praise, who we hold accountable for their actions, or perhaps their refraining from action. So these, I would posit, are the three ways why and how luck matters and why luck deserves to be an object of interest to us. And we can see that actually the notion does pop up actually quite often, not only in our daily talk, but also in scholarship, whether it's international relations or something else entirely. So I think this fairly intuitive, but nevertheless also slippery concept does deserve our attention. But like Ben was saying at the start, we are here not necessarily trying to define, trying to lock in concepts into some neat definitions. And I think luck is one of those concepts that tends to sort of elude that kind of neat packaging. So although there have been attempts to define the concept, and I'm happy to go into these in more detail in the Q&A, I think that there is value to the concept, even though we cannot necessarily pin it down in an entirely satisfactory way. And indeed, perhaps it is the ambiguity, again, of that concept that does give it some, additional leverage as a piece of explanation, but also as a piece of how we talk about our place in the world, including in international politics. And I am almost out of time, so I will not go into what I do in my thesis in terms of, okay, what are the sources that I then draw on in order to think about, like, in perhaps slightly different ways. But that is indeed what I do by looking at thinkers like Thucydides, Machiavelli, and Clausewitz, and see what they have done with in their thinking and in their work with luck in its various different forms. Again, happy to go into them in more detail later. So just to wrap up, really is that I would therefore argue that luck deserves attention for as a mode of explanation, as a mode of attribution, and as also as a notion that is invoked morally for either to blame or perhaps avoid blame, for example. And luck may not help us to necessarily solve problems, but I think it will help us to see international politics again in a richer light, and also to understand how past thinkers have tried to grapple with the sort of uncertainties, the unexpected of international politics. So I would argue that we should listen to luck. But before we move on to listening about listening, I would just like to wrap up with a quote from Robert McNamara, who was, of course, the Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And later in his years, he said that, in the end, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. So I'll leave you with that cheery thought. So thanks very much, and look forward to hearing more.
Okay, thank you so much. I will echo the sentiments, and a thank you to Benedict for conceptualizing Concept Club and for facilitating this today. And Tuka, you said you had the tough job of bridging the two concepts, but I think that I am burdened by coming after both of you. As Benedict was alluding to, my concept is less well done, less well cooked. But yeah, I'm happy to present it nonetheless. So my concept is, what does it mean to listen in international relations? And it's the basis of my PhD research. The type of listening that I'm going to be talking about is the type of listening that's done sort of outside of these realms of spying and espionage. And rather, it's the type of listening that advocates for all sorts of causes around the world are asking for from states. I first became interested in investigating this concept because I was researching the Australia-Pacific climate change relationship. And I was so struck by how often this promise to listen was being elucidated in Australian discourse. In just about every diplomatic speech and document within this current Albanese era of Pacific relations, addressing the Pacific's concern about the climate, Australian politicians and senior bureaucrats would constantly underscore what an effort they were putting in to listen. I suppose what had made this so surprising to me is that I had been on the other side of climate advocacy. During my university years, I was a youth climate activist, and I had built entire campaigns around this idea that young people, not only at my university, but in Australia, in the Pacific, and in Asia, were feeling very unlistened to. In fact, if you Google me, which I don't necessarily recommend you do, you can read this digital footprint of my advocacy using the word listening. I had wrote an opinion piece in the blog Monash Lens, where I had argued that I benefited from the listening that I did to Pacific advocates during my time at the UN Climate Conference, COP27, and thus I posited that negotiators for Australia should be doing the same and listening. Another opinion piece I wrote with my master's thesis supervisor similarly echoed this sentiment, and I cynically quip, of course, whether world leaders actually listen is another story. As I have dug, listening and whether or not states listen in international relations, I've realized it's extremely contested. To create a fun hook for my first year PhD seminar presentation, I found 5 different faculty members within our Department of International Relations who had all, in their extremely varied areas of expertise, asked for states to listen. I think we face these enormous, complex, devastating global issues. And when we feel that states are permitting such devastation, we have this instinct to pose listening as a solution, as though we imagine that if states come down to the level of us people, talked to us, and listened to the people being affected, then the state representatives would be so inevitably emotionally moved that they enact change and the devastation would cease. But to me, this feels somewhat imaginary. In my aforementioned career as a youth climate activist, I have been the person being asked to be listened to, and I've also supported Pacific colleagues in meeting with Australian government departments. What was clear in all of these experiences is that to be listened to is way more than being consulted. It is an emotional ask, and often it's just a polite way of asking for action. It is often fueled by frustration and a desire to be shown some human dignity. I pause here to say that when I first began this project on listening, which many of you were privy to, I had created pretty rigid categories around what it had meant to listen. I had all sorts of diagrams and all sorts of vogue lexicon that I had been designing in an attempt to categorize the experiences of international listening. However, as I have alluded to, listening is so subjective and is such a personal desire that I was finding it difficult to fit even my own experiences of listening within these categories. Hence, my research was redesigned to be grounded, which means that my theorizing will come after I've done my fieldwork and be grounded in the ideas, opinions, thoughts that I gather from my participants. Hence, very much in the spirit of Concept Club, I'm not going to provide a definition. And whilst many people in my life have been asking me how they should personally improve their listening skills, for now I can't concretely say. Rather, I have a series of framing questions around the concept of listening that I'm going to present. So firstly, is listening even something that a state can do? Take this very real Guardian headline about the genocide in Gaza. Israel needs to listen to calls for restraints from its friends. What is being evoked here? In this situation, who is Israel? Who within the Israeli state is expected to listen? Is it senior leadership that should listen? Or maybe even the whole population of Israel is expected? In that vein, is listening consultation? Do people asking to be listened to just want to sit down with state representatives and be heard? Does it matter who gets to choose the location, the time, the room setup, the language, even the temperature of the room during the consultation? Especially in places like the Pacific, cultures of listening differ completely. In the Pacific, they often favor much longer, more personal conversations, sometimes out on the floor or outside. Does not having full control over the consultation change the experience of being listened to? Or is the catharsis of just talking what is desired? Within this train of thought, many people have offered to me that there are differences between being listened to and being heard. I note that people have actually used these two terms to me in opposition and in either direction. For example, I've been told I felt listened to but not heard, but I've also been told I have been heard but not actually listened to. What both imply is that there is this difference between having the opportunity to talk to someone and then having what you say actually considered and actioned. So is listening actually asking for attention or even for action? I see here that there is a difference between listening as a means and listening as an end. Hence, I propose, is consultation a method of state in action? A way that they can say that they are doing the right thing, even doing what they have been asked to do, but all in an effort to not actually do what's really being desired. For example, Australia, by consulting Pacific Islanders, can say that they are listening on climate change without ever even turning off a single coal power plant. In this way, the devastation hoped to be curbed by listening continues. This use of listening, it feels cruel and kind of like cheating. So perhaps, I'm going to use a word we have an expert on in the room, and perhaps in that is listening empathy. Is it the hope that you say something so important that you spark the humanity in the public servant sitting across from you on the other side, that they get so emotional they go back to their desk filled with these emotions and take down the system from the inside? Or perhaps that Anthony Albanese himself reads an article that you've written, which causes him to dig so deep inside his hard politician exterior to find his squishy human center, to realize that the approval of the expansion of the Woodside Northwest Shelf gas project is a devastating thing to have done. Listening is so intellectually stimulating as a concept, because everyone seems to have these incredibly varied different skills when it comes to listening, but it also incredibly varied expectations of what the experience of being listened to should actually feel like. Given how often we use this word within international relations, particularly as it pertains to being a solution to the greatest issues of our time, I find it a very worthwhile endeavor for me to continue to put in the work and try and define it. Listening is currently this site of tension, when I believe it really should be the site of solution, empathy, and collaboration. Thank you so much for listening.
I'm Ming Son, so also a PhD student at the IR department. Nice to meet you all for the first time ever. Actually, I don't know if they're actually listening, but it's okay. I also quite relate to a lot of the ways that, not the ways in which, the ways that you guys have talked about different concepts, how it's sort of work around in international relations, because I also grapple with a concept I've also sought to understand myself, which a bit crass, but it's about size in international relations. Does size matter? Which it sounds quite rude, but it is quite important. Because in a way, a lot of these concepts that we have grappled with, ambiguity, lock, and listening, kind of tread a territory where everyone kind of knows what they are, but trying to figure out what they really mean on the ground in the very different contexts is very difficult. So I have one big question for you two, and also each of you guys, I will have one or two questions as well, just to kind of open up the discussions a bit. When you talk about concept, it pertains language, and the easiest thing that I can see when it comes to these concepts and the problems is that where does it travel in terms of language, right? So problem translation, for example, to different contexts. I know one of us works in politics of China. I do really wonder how when you kind of grapple with this concept and their sort of abstraction, how do you kind of convey these to a different cultural context in a way that preserve the meaning you guys are trying to impart on, and sort of work that into your own research as well. Because as I'm sure, lock, ambiguity, and listening have very different translations and connotation in different languages. English is relatively precise, but I don't know, Vietnamese and Fijian, maybe they have different contexts, different understanding. About luck, I'm quite intrigued by the positing of luck as an useful concept, and I just really wonder how. And it makes me think about the idea of counterfactuals. What if things have gone a different ways? I really do wonder if policymakers are, in their research, you come across this counterfactual thinking among the people who make policy as well. And how do you conceptualize luck in your research, and what does it do specifically analytically? On ambiguity, I'm returning a bit to the questions of language. I'm very curious because you have a very in-depth understanding and granular understanding of Chinese politics, which I'm sure is your PhD. I'm really curious how different expectations and cultures of calculations in the Chinese context when it regards to economic difficulties happen. In the English Anglophone world, in the Western world, we kind of see information thrown everywhere. The media, the public, everyone can kind of chime in. But this is same sort of discordant mess of information happens in the same context with the Chinese. Or are there a lot of rivaling different interpretations of ambiguity or ambiguous concept and uncertainties, particularly with crises, which are essentially a pivotal moment where things could have gone a completely different way. It unravels and connects different dots all together and retrospectively reconfigures our understanding of things that have gone past. And just wondering on how, in the Chinese context and their discussions, how they kind of wrestle with that. And on listening, I'm also very partial to this idea as well on listening. When we talk about the state, I always imagine it as a very abstract thing, and For me, I only see the state not as literally existing in reality, but only its constituent parts. You see it through bureaucracies, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, various other ministries, and the people working on the ground, the street level bureaucracy. And so I'm in your research, where are the areas where the state comes alive and listen? Whose ears are we talking about? Is it the people on the ground? Or do you mean more abstractly in terms of public discourse? And I think these questions of the immediate context, literally this room itself, is important when it comes to listening. And it also points to the limits where ideas can only travel so far. I'm sure, like when you mentioned that they felt listened to but not heard, it does kind of point to the implications of when listening doesn't go far enough. It becomes some sort of performative act. And I wonder if the Australian context is particularly ripe for this, because I find Australian listen a lot, but I'm not sure about if it does anything, but at least in other contexts they do. Anyway, that should be it, yeah. Yeah, just to open and not point out.
Are you happy to respond in Yeah. And do we need to pass the microphone back, or should our speakers return to the lectern, or what's necessary?
I'll just hold on to it, just pass on, yeah.
Thank you so much for the question. I'd like to double check the question about language. Do you mean like how we can translate our concept to the other language and whether it will lose any meanings about that? That is a good question. I'm thinking I never translate, I never do any Chinese language journal articles. If I would like to translate ambiguity and maybe directly translate it into 模糊性, but I need to really define it and like to highlight it means the diverse interpretation possibilities of the one things. And I think it actually makes sense because it actually means like there's for this one cup, you see it from the different perspectives, and maybe you will see the different things. And according to the economic fundamentals, in the different time, the different people, they see the different angles. Maybe it will yield to the different policy preferences. And I can link to the second question about how it can actually ground in the empirical cases. There are two examples I really like how to say the ambiguity in the Chinese context. The first interesting case study is about in the late 1980s and how the China interpreted the inflation level. So we all know that China opened up its market from the 1978, and the China achieves very rapid economic growth after that, and also the very high inflation level. So about the mid 1980s, the China has an inflation level about like 10%. So what do you think about the 1% inflation level in your life? And some people will think it means very dangerous because the inflation might rise up and it will mean like we will have the economic instability, right? There are also some people think this high inflation is tolerable because it's a necessary cost you need to pay for the high growth rate. So there are actually also such debate among the Chinese economists. And also there is divisions in the political leaders as well. And at that time, Deng Xiaoping and Zhao Ziyang, they think this inflation rate is tolerable. They even sent a group of economists to the Brazil and looking at how the people are living there with a high inflation rate. And they come back and saying that they have a higher inflation level. So their people can live in such a high inflation level environment. Why don't Chinese people can't stand that? So we need to open up our market more. And then there are also other conservatives and saying that no, we need to be cautious and we need to constrain the local investment and trying to contain the inflation level. We need to slow down our economic liberalization. And then after the debate, and finally, we know that China in the late 1980s established a socialist market economy. It actually means that from then, the China trying to slow down its financial decentralization from then because they realize the inflation level is very dangerous. So it's actually really depend on your interpretation. And another case is more contemporary. I'm not sure like any of you have heard about the 2015 stock market crash. Now we see that Xi Jinping actually have a very heavy hand over the economy, right? You maybe heard about how intensified the China has a financial regulation and it become the crackdown on the housing sector. But actually, when he took the office, the Xi Jinping is very optimistic about the market liberalization. At that time, if you check the Western media, and some media even said it's a second Deng Xiaoping, and you can't imagine that nowadays. What changed? When Xi took the office, he tried very hard to pump up the stock market investment to encourage the Chinese people to invest in the stock market and trying to have the more capital to finance the state economy. And at that time, if you were in China, everyone talks about the stock market. So nobody really questions the financial liberalization. It sounds a very fantastic idea. And the state was in the back about this stock market boom. But after the 2015 stock market crash, which was absolutely unexpected by Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping became very cautious about financial liberalization. You see that this is the same thing, the financial liberalization. You could see it has a very helpful to stimulate the growth, to speed up the financial liberalization. It can allow the state to have the more capital, but it can also bring the more instability. So after that, Xi Jinping thought the financial market could be very dangerous and volatile and become very cautious and trying to have the very tight regulations over the financial sector. So I think it's an example. Like for the economic fundamentals, the neoclassical economists think we can directly rationally read that and we will know the wiser, we will have the wiser option. But actually, it really depends on how to think about it.
Cool. Yeah, thanks very much for your questions, Ming-Son. So yeah, okay. So first about language and the notion of luck and translation, or how do these concepts travel. So yeah, I think you're putting your finger on a very important point here. There's probably again notions like luck, which, as I've mentioned during the presentation, also draws close to it. Other notions like contingency, chance, fortune, fluke. You can think of other similar words. They seem to be talking about similar things, but then again, they seem also to put the accents different. So I think there is, to go back to ambiguity, there's a lot of sort of inherent ambiguity to these kinds of concepts. And I think it's helpful to think of, say, the notion of luck as kind of like floating signifier. So it has, there's sort of like a conceptual core that we can sort of get intuitively, but when we try to put it into words, put it into practice, it starts to become actually very slippery, right? And that's not even taking into consideration then, okay, well, what are the connotations in different languages over time, in different settings, and so on and so forth. So that only adds to the complexity of these notions. And for example, in my work, when I'm reading, you know, Thucydides, Machiavelli, or Clausewitz, well, they all are in translation, right? So that in itself, well, I sort of brush away that factor, but that is certainly sort of something to be cautious about when dealing with concepts. That said, though, I think that there probably are these sort of like universals that do sort of resonate with us. And I'd say that luck is one of those notions, and it's something that we can quite intuitively relate to in some ways, in many ways, in fact, but it's also at the same time very hard to then start to put into words. And philosophers have tried, but I think no one's come up with a really good, solid definition. And then about more specifically about counterfactuals, and again, what does luck do, and whether, you know, how do we see, for example, politicians, policymakers invoke the concept. So I think, yeah, counterfactuals. I'm glad you brought up this other important concept, and for especially historical explanation, I think it's something that, well, certainly academics have been talking about, and I think it's something that we, again, almost instinctively do ourselves as well, right? Imagining potential different pasts and futures. And I think one of the utility of luck, I feel, is that it can help us to open up, again, the possibility space in when we think of how things could have been. So it's a kind of a different way of getting to the same endpoint. I think counterfactual is a bit more sort of like a rigorous way of actually thinking about something that, again, resonates with our experience. Luck is the more sort of everyday manifestation of that in our spoken language. And then, no doubt, politicians and policymakers also do reflect on how things could be, how things could have been. And I think it's quite clear, for example, in the McNamara quote that I brought up. Again, probably very situational. Sometimes you might look back with, wisdom of hindsight. You might say, oh, actually, things were far less under control than we would have liked to imagine. And other times you might look back and see, okay, well, actually now when I look at, the past and how, how things unfolded, that makes sense now, even though at the present it all might have seemed very sort of surprising or unexpected. So again, I think the utility of a concept like luck is in helping us to, bring in the vocabulary of thinking, okay, but there are different ways of explaining, of describing, say, the past and how events unfolded. And often these different ways of looking at events also then become contested, right? So you can have different stories, different versions of the same event, kind of like Wenting's example of, the cup or the, financial reforms and so on. So I think I'll just park it there, but certainly things that I also have been trying to grapple with and hopefully open up some space for these sorts of discussions.
Thank you so much. It's a great question. In terms of translation, I was looking for it. This image must go around at like work training programs. Like it's I mean, you could probably have a look at it. It's like, yeah, it's like the Chinese character for listening. And like I've been sent it multiple times because people like take sneaky photos of it during like a training session. They go, look at this thing, Izzy. And they use it in these training sessions because the character is broken down into different aspects of listening. So it includes ears to hear, eyes to see, undivided attention, heart to feel, and a mind to think. And so I think that whilst that's not anything to do with my case study per se, but it is indicative of the fact that from where you come from and the way in which people listened to you when you were a child, and then the way in which listening happens in your culture is incredibly important to the way in which you perceive being listened to by the state within international relations, which also then connects to your second question here about, where does the state come alive and what are these expectations of which part of the state listens to you? Because I think I agree. My original conceptualization of all of this was in some ways almost metaphorical or something, right? It was to have such a large expectation that this non-bodied, non-ear having thing could do to listen to you. It feels imaginary, but I think you're right that there are these varied expectations. From what I know so far and the people that I've talked to so far, sometimes it is the desire to have a public servant in your sector of concern to actually sit down and listen to you and to have a frank conversation with them. But I think for the most part, it seems this idea of what you were saying, it's the passing on of ideas and then the actioning of these ideas seems to be much more pertinent. For example, as I was talking about, I had this experience where I worked with some youth climate activists from the Pacific, and we took them to 2 different government departments, which I don't name, but I think you will know which one is which, just by the way I described them. The first, we went, and they were very cordial. They were professional diplomats, and we sat in this room and they were excellent active listeners, right? We had these diplomats on the other side of the table nodding and smiling and giving the youth activists we'd brought to them undivided attention. But when I left there, I asked them, the Pacific advocates, did they feel listened to? And the answer was no, even though they had this excellent experience of rigid active listening. They didn't feel like they felt it was this courtesy, right? That they didn't feel actioned. Then we went into another department, and it was a lot more casual. We were sort of sat around this much sort of larger table, and actually the bureaucrats we spoke to spoke for about half of the session, and they were speaking about all these wonderful things that Australia was doing to do with climate and la la la. And I walked away being like, God, they spoke a lot. And then I asked these students that I was with, did they feel listened to after that experience? And they said yes. They thought it was so impressive that they didn't think anything was happening in Australia to do with climate change. And so the fact that they were able to, they did the listening and they could consume that information, they felt like they were being listened to. And so you're right, it's about this idea transfer rather than the act of actual listening itself. But again, it's very subjective. So I can't say that there aren't people who do want that catharsis of just speaking to diplomats. But I do think that there is these larger conversations around idea transfer that you alluded to.
I think one question here, which is Megan, and we've got about 5 minutes. So
Okay, I can do that. I have, Megan Michelli. I'm a PhD student at RegNet at ANU. I have one question for Tuka and one question for Izzy. Tuka, I think that your PhD is super interesting, and I'm wondering how you balance this notion of luck with the structural conditions that create different types of happenstance to actually occur, if that makes sense. And I'm sure you've been asked this question before. And then Izzy, my question to you is, and ironically, you asked me a very similar question in my MTR, but I'm just curious to know more about the gendered elements of this, but in a twofold way, because I think the surface way of interpreting that question would be how listening manifests in your data when you do eventually collect it. And obviously that will have a gendered dynamic. But also I'm interested in how your approach is gendered and therefore impacts how you are exploring this notion of listening, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's.
I think, thank you so much. It's like one of my favorite questions because I've been thinking about it a lot. Actually, my PhD office roommate suggested that I should read a book she found in Dymocks called How Women Listen. And it is, it's this, and I've been reading all these other things about like the feminist counseling techniques and all of these experiences that like, we have this expectation that women are better listeners and that women, we're since a young age, we're socialized to be better listeners. And so there is that element there around this about how my methodologies is kind of, it's feminine and it's feminist. And I think that's a really cool thing about the research that I'm doing. But I think as well in terms of gender, so I've done a document analysis to see all the times in which listening was coming up within this sort of discourse. And one of the things that I did is I was reading these things about women and from the Pacific asking to be listened to. And I realized maybe I should chuck in with the word woman or gender. And I realized, and once I did that, it exploded. There's an enormous amount of women asking to be listened to. And I think on the other side, it's also a showing of power, right? That listening is your attempt, asking a state to listen is your attempt to, I think George Lawson said this during my TPR, to level power. It's your attempt to bring the state, which you see as this powerful entity who has the power to make the difference that you want to see, down to your level. And I think that's an aspect in which gender reveals it, that sort of power element. So I think it's such a wonderful question. Thank you.
All right. And also, yeah, thanks very much for the sort of like eternal questions of like structure, agency, luck. So yeah, again, certainly at the core of a lot of I guess internal debates I'm having with the concept of luck and its utility and so on. And I think in my talk, I was sort of posting like as kind of a critique or a counterpoint to, more like structuralist, determinist accounts. And that's partly sort of situate my own work in relation to some of the sort of mainstream IR ways of thinking about things. And again, I think it's partly a matter of utility. So again, we see different things as we take these different kinds of, I guess, concepts at the forefront of our, the way we look at politics. And I say, yeah, so there's a couple of different ways of approaching this. So one is to see, say, luck or say chance and structure as somehow, you know, opposite to one another, or in tension with one another. So yeah, if it's, you know, chancy, it wasn't sort of structured, right? But the other way to look at it is to actually see them as sort of complementary, right? So you can't really have, you know, happenstance without having all events take place in, you know, in the world that is, you know, shaped by prior events and so on and so forth. So I think there's partly this kind of like a dialectic between these different notions. And I think if we wanted to use, say, luck as a sort of like an analytical device to look at and explain political events, historical events, and so on, I think we might think of it as a sort of like an intervening variable almost, you know, chance events intervene in ways that were not anticipated. So this is one way of sort of operationalizing the concept of luck if we were to go down that route. Then again, there are different ways in which we can employ the concept, and I'm sort of like, I guess, vacillating between these different ways of using the notion, and I find different uses for it as well, which probably explains why I'm still stuck in doing my PhD. And therefore, yeah, my life is structured by these concepts as well. But excellent question. Thanks very much. Maybe not satisfactorily answered.
Question? Yeah. It's 7 o'clock. If we're happy to keep discussing.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. Nick Stewart, PhD begun in 95, not yet submitted. I just wanted to, these should be incredibly subversive concepts, but it seems to me when I was in Xinjiang last year, I saw ambiguity used by the government in which was doing one thing, but it was using ambiguity in a very effective way to possibly mask some of the activities that it was using at the time. With luck, I mean, we say, oh, the amazement of having the Archduke being shot in Sarajevo somehow or another masks the intricate network of alliances that was inevitably going to lead, as you said, you know, there was another occasion that day that and there were I think 7 assassins planning to kill the Archduke. You know, isn't it interesting the way that finally Penny, for example, uses the word listening in a method that when she's quite obviously not listening at all. The only listening that she's doing is to the Poles and to political masters. So what I would be interested in is the way you think these notionally revolutionary ideas are being subverted by being incorporated into political discourse.
Where would you like to go?
Yes, I think so. This is a wonderful question. It really captured like one of my research about the relationship between the ambiguity and the government. Like the policymakers can usually strategically use the ambiguity in the rules and procedures and to, I would say the manipulate might be a negative word, but to use it in a different ways and to suit their changing preferences. And for the policymakers, I think it's sometimes a good thing to have. And I think in a lot of international agreements, we will see that policymakers consciously leave the ambiguity in the rules and procedures. And it's a so normal thing for the broader political world, like ambiguity can be good, ambiguity can be normal, but it's less common in the economic world. Like, as I said, the people like anxiously looking for more information. They think if we can have the full information, we can have the best economic policy. And that has really struck me. And I think it's absolutely not true. And I love analysis by a Canadian scholar, Jacqueline Best, when she talked about why we have the more economic crisis nowadays, especially in the 21st century. Like from the late last century, we have the Asian financial crisis, and then we have the global financial crisis. And the COVID, of course, is more like exogenous shocks, but it's obviously it's a challenge to the neoliberalism. For a very long time, we believe in it's the truth in the economic world, but it's not. Back in the post-World War II, when we have the Bretton Woods Agreement, if you look at that agreement, there's a lot of ambiguity. It's agreement influenced by the Keynesianism, right? Keynes is actually very much looked for how the emotions, how the self-reinforcing pessimisms or the optimistic minds can actually shape our financial market. So it does not believe in that we can have the rational and only one way to reading the economic fundamentals, if you remember. And if you look at the Bretton Woods Agreement, there's no definite relations with between the debtors and the creditors. And even the linchpin of that agreement called fundamental disequilibrium, and it's not defined, even though it's the most important indicator whether you can alter your exchange rate or not. But into the 1970s, we have the neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, it has the liberalism, but you're actually not free at all because you need to remove all of your capital controls. And the market has an invisible hand. And for my generation, when I studied economics for my undergraduate degree, that is the only thing I studied for my university. The beautiful models and mathematics, and I don't love it. Not only because I'm bad at the mathematics, I just thought it does not make sense, right? If I can beautifully master those models and statistics, can I have the better investment decisions? I don't need to do my PhD and buy a house in a Red Hill. Do you think that is true? I don't think so. And if you look at the market, it's all about the emotions. And now we can embrace this idea, but we have so much overconfidence in the past decade about how the neoclassical economists can tell us everything. So I think there's a kind of like things in the economics world. Yeah.
Hey, thanks very much, Nick. Is that right? Yeah. Awesome question once again. Yeah, so I think this goes back to how these concepts are malleable, they're ambiguous, they can be recruited for various different kinds of purposes, and for sure, sort of cooptation of something that may be seemingly subversive is certainly part of the reality of the lives of these concepts. And like you were saying, luck can also easily conceal other kinds of explanations, can conceal responsibility. Well, it's how tragic that these 20 people happened to die because we decided to launch a drone attack in this particular place in this particular time. It wasn't our intention, but collateral damage and so on. Bad luck, tragic, right? So again, luck is by no means a concept that is necessarily just a good thing or helpful thing. It can also be something that conceals power, conceals responsibility. And I think that's, again, a reason for us to be sort of cautious and wary of it. And this is the sort of the other side of the other way of thinking about the concept is that it's, well, again, it's part of this construction of, stories, right? Stories we tell to each other. And these may be contestable and probably should be contested. So I think that's one of the, perhaps the sort of more useful ways of thinking about this particular concept is looking at how it's actually being deployed, used, and what are the implications of that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I have that's exact sentiment around. That's why it's so interesting listening. It's the way it's being deployed, right? And I think like the rhetorical heel change around "we are now listening to the Pacific" has, and with this, Albanese government and the way that they've become so persistent with this line makes it feel so disingenuous, because at the same time, they're receiving so much commentary, both in the public sphere and I think within their own bureaucracy, that, this listening isn't working and that they seem very disingenuous. And I think it is that experience. And so, and I think that you're onto something. And I guess why I think it's important is because I still see that if good listening, and maybe it is the listening of the ideas exchange, but or maybe it is also this person to person listening feeling, I think it could be this site of solution. I think it has the potential for it. And so I think by using this word in this very disingenuous way almost, it cheapens what listening means. It cheapens the concept of listening itself. It cheapens what listening means to these Pacific Islanders, particularly the Pacific Islanders who are fighting for the climate. Like, it cheapens how much they really mean that they want to be listened to, right? But in many ways, it also undermines and cheapens the listening that's happening within the bureaucracy at the moment. Like, I'm talking to people who work within the APS who say that they are doing these listening consultation things, but because of the way the bureaucracy works, it just doesn't translate upwards in a very well. Yeah, it doesn't even matter that they're having constant conversations with Pacific colleagues because they're under such a time crunch for the most time that's not even considered on the way up. So I think that you're onto something fantastic, and that I think that's what makes me so mad is that I really believe in listening, but the way in which it's being deployed completely undermines its efficacy within this particular relationship, but in international relations in general.
One person at the back who's been waiting patiently. We have one more question, and then maybe we can continue over. We can discuss more informally, if I can.
I'm Jessica, master's student. So I've got two I guess, comments for Tuka and for the third speaker. So with luck, how would you define luck and its limitations? So for example, whether it's something that's a dehumanized decision and action, like for example, it was raining and so therefore like a flight was canceled, but then again, would you say, how far back would you track? Would you say, well, that's climate change because of it, like it was raining, or the position of like human leverage, such as buying more lottery tickets technically gives you more chances. So therefore, in a position of leverage, as well as your constraints in where you're using luck, whether in your examples you used crises, but also in, for example, in diplomatic interactions where, as I said, like, let's say a diplomat missed a flight, and so therefore they couldn't attend a conference. So what are your restraints in your applying luck? And then as well for our third speaker, it had me thinking about especially can states listen to people and can states feel emotions? It does remind me of sociology and the idea of where does emotion lie with, whether it's the actors of the state, whether it's the head of state or its representatives and as the diplomats, of course the public, but then as well to the extent of getting enough voices of the public, as well as, let's say, the cultural identity of a state in that it starts to embody its own personality and emotions. And also the perspective of rationality as well, because emotions are not very rational, but in the enactment of the state's wishes are often quite controlled. And so, for example, there's like social norms, like you not expected to laugh at a funeral, for example. So therefore, at negotiation tables, diplomats might feel as though to show good face, they're going to look like they're listening, whether they choose to actually actively engage or not.
I can go. Yeah, thank you so much, Jessica. Yeah, I think the emotions are very important to not only listening but feeling listened to. Like if the other person, especially on topics that are so emotional like the experiences of climate change, if the other person is not matching you in terms of emotions, it feels like a really bad interaction, right? And so one of the things that I've been thinking about, and that seems evident in what I'm finding, is exactly what you're alluding to in the second part of your question there, in terms of the fact that there's this culture within the Australian bureaucracy to not show emotion. And this is little things like, I was talking to a Tongan diplomat who was talking about how Australian bureaucrats are not as personable as the other Pacific bureaucrats that they work with. There's that level of not wanting to talk necessarily about your kids or like your family, but that's such an important part of having these sorts of listening interactions. And so there's a culture within the state itself. And so I would say, I agree with Min-Son, is that the state is a sort of a construction. So the state itself is not a person, which means it can't feel emotion. But I would say that the construction of the state also restricts the people who work within it from feeling that emotion or from indulging in that emotion. And I think the indulgement of emotions, particularly, again, to draw back to climate change, if you don't feel the way that other people are experiencing that crisis, I don't understand how you would act on it in a way that would be, fair, So I think you're onto something in that there is this muting or dulling of emotions that prevents this effective listening interactions from occurring.
Cool. Yeah, really great questions, Jessica. So about the sort of limitations of the notion of luck. So yeah, we're probably actually in academia often really quite limited in talking about things like luck, perhaps because it invokes some sort of out-of-date notions, perhaps it sounds superstitious and so on. And that certainly is one, well, several facets of the concept and how it has traveled over time and developed, right? And we then start to bump against the kind of okay, so what do we attribute things to, right? Is luck actually helping us to reason why it's raining? Well, perhaps not. And there are other, perhaps better models of explaining rain than, or the timing of rain or what it's raining more than just pure happenstance, right? But at the same time, I'd say that doesn't also exclude luck, right? It can still be unlucky that it was raining so much that prevented the diplomat from catching the flight to a conference or something of that sort, right? So I think these notions can also coexist, and sometimes, and I think often actually they do, they coexist in perhaps in different different registers of just how we talk about the world. They coexist on different levels of explanation. So again, something that, well, what we encounter, what we experience in our daily lives, we might easily, label luck or lucky or chance and so on. And because that makes sense in that moment, perhaps it's, it's enough for us. But then in other contexts, we might actually want to, explain why it was raining so much, right? And that we can then draw on other models such as climate change to explain that. So again, I think what is important for luck is that it seems to have almost inevitably this sort of a subjective dimension to it, and it's about something that is important for whatever reason for a particular entity, a person at a particular time and place and so on. So it is contextualized, it's situated often. At least that's the way we tend to use and talk about luck, but it's not able to explain everything, and we will soon contest ways in which events might be attributed to luck, right? But at the same time, I think we then easily can start to question, okay, but why is the world the way it is, and isn't it, luck all the way down, as some philosophers would argue? So we end up in these very murky debates as we start to follow the concept and the kind of line of thought that you were quite helpfully raising there. So again, no final answers, but rather perhaps just more confusion and more questions, which is just as well, I would say. Thanks, Benedict.
Oh, well, thank you for coming, and thank you to hear me again.